Yeah, thank you very much. Hello, my name is Янина Ло. Thank you very much for inviting me to this great event. I'm very happy to be here. It's my first time in Russia. Right, maybe a couple of words why this topic in this context. Yeah, as you just heard, I am working as a postdoc at the University of Vienna in the area of philosophy of technology and media, and I am specialized, so to speak, in the fields of robot ethics, transhumanism, posthumanism, responsibility research. That is one other important topic, Hannah Arendt, and feminist philosophy of technology. And I'm just about to publish my next book. I'm very excited to tell you that that next week, actually, the first German introduction to trans and posthumanism will be published at the, at least in Germany, famous publisher Junius. And yeah, I was asked to talk about the humanistic and Enlightenment and Kantian roots in trans and posthumanism. So this is what will happen here in the next 30 minutes. After a very short introduction, I will, in the second part of my talk, explain what transhumanism, technological posthumanism, and critical posthumanism is. And then in the third part of the talk, I will come to the aliens are landing. I will come to the humanistic, Enlightenment, and Kantian roots of transhumanism, technological, and critical posthumanism. And after 25 to 30 minutes, I will conclude. Okay. So transhumanism and posthumanism are two, and actually I would have to say three, very heterogeneous movements of the late 20th century, found in philosophical anthropology and philosophy of technology. They combine several disciplines besides philosophy, social and cultural studies, also AI and computer sciences. Trans and posthumanism reveal their humanistic roots already by their names, as you can guess. Their proponents understand themselves on the one hand as technologically advancing Renaissance humanism, that is transhumanism, as mostly ignorant of the humanistic Enlightenment and Kantian heritage, that would be technological posthumanism, and on the other hand, in critically distancing themselves from thinking and philosophy of the Enlightenment, and that is what I would call critical posthumanism. Trans and posthumanism regard implicitly or explicitly the humanistic human being as a starting point for their analysis. And Immanuel Kant plays different roles within the trans and posthumanist paradigm, as this talk intends to show. As you already noticed, I basically read the slides, but I think that it's better to read and to listen and not to different things. I will basically proceed as I started, and I will now come to the second part: transhumanism, technological posthumanism, and critical posthumanism. Well, transhumanism attempts to develop, enhance, and perfect man by technologically transforming her or him into a post-human being. And the post-human being, that is nothing that you can find on the slides. The post-human being is something that you will find in all of these three discourses. The post-human or the post-human being defines the aim, the goal of the achievements of transhumanists and posthumanists. But you can find the post-human being in transhumanism, in technological, and in critical posthumanism, although in very different ways.
We still have slide number 1 showing.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Yeah, that is actually pretty stupid with like my own notebook and then the slides over there. Sorry. So the post-human in the transhumanist tradition is a new human being. It is still a human being. It is not something else. It is still a developed human being 2.0, or to be more precise, a human being X.0, since from a transhumanist point of view, the potential evolution of man is necessarily unfinished. It could go on and on and on indefinitely. The trans in transhumanism refers to the attempt to create a new and better mode of human existence in working one's way through the current human, so to speak. The role and function of techniques, and when I say techniques, I mean technologies as artificial objects on the one hand, and techniques as standardized practice and ways of doing something. The role and function of techniques is medium and means for the purpose of optimizing man to a human being X.0. Techniques is never more important than the humans are. Techniques is always good insofar as it helps the human being to transform to a post-human being in the end. There are other characteristics in transhumanism. One of the most important goals in transhumanist thinking is immortality, or at least radical life extension. And as long as that is not reached, you find a lot of transhumanists who are talking about cryonics, a way of deep freezing the human body, or at least the head of a person, until at some point in the future it can be awakened again, warmed up again, and then be ready for the post-human era. The most important methods in transhumanism are methods of human enhancement, ranging from physical enhancement like cosmetics and plastic surgery and sports gymnastic, over genetic enhancement and up to neural enhancement and moral enhancement even. Transhumanists also speak often of transhuman beings. Transhuman beings are those beings that are already on their way to the post-human era. Transhuman beings are those that have already transformed a little bit, but not that much that they could be called a post-human being. That maybe human beings 2.0 or 3.0, but they already did something with their body and with their mind. Maybe they have some prosthetics or some implants, or they take some medicals to be more intelligent or something like that. And virtuality and space as potential spheres of post-human existence play also a huge role in transhumanism. So I have another slide on the pioneers and first proponents of transhumanist thinking, but I actually will skip that slide. I have for each of those three discourses a slide with the pioneers and the first proponents, and I will come back to it if you're interested in it in the discussion. I think for now it might be good to concentrate on the basic elements of trans and post-humanism. So I will move on to, to technological post-humanism. In technological post-humanism, actually, the vision of the post-human has radically changed in contrast to the transhumanist paradigm. In post-humanism in general, whether it is technological or critical post-humanism, it is not so much more the human being that is of interest. Post-humanism in general is no longer primarily interested in man, and the vision of the post-human in technological post-humanism is actually an artificial alterity, an artificial superintelligence, maybe a strong AI or universal AI that in the end will surpass man by constituting a new species, evolution's next step, so to speak. And that is radically different from the transhumanist vision, right? Because in transhumanism, the post-human being is still a human being, and here it is an artificial supercomputer or superintelligence. Of course, on their way to the singularity, and that would be the stage when we are finally able to upload our mind of a computer, or when the computers finally will wake up. On their way to the singularity, of course, human beings will also profit from technological achievements, of course, and modify and enhance themselves by means of these advances. For instance, by merging with nanobots. The nanobots are teeny tiny robots that can do great stuff in your body, in a nutshell. And eventually be immortalized through uploading the human mind onto a computer. And that is the reason why a lot of transhumanists would say that technological posthumanism is very alike the transhumanist thinking, because of course the human being is not forgotten. It is still there also in the technological posthumanist thinking, but this vision of a modified human being of the technologically transformed human being is merely an automatic step on man's way towards the post-human era rather than the ultimate ambition. The ultimate ambition in technological post-humanism is to create an artificial superintelligence. And therefore, the role and function of techniques also is very different from the role and function of techniques in transhumanism. In transhumanism, techniques plays the role of medium and means for the transformation of the human being. In technological posthumanism now, it is primarily seen as end, aim, and purpose, because techniques in the version of an artificial alterity will be evolution's next step. Further characteristics beside artificial superintelligence and the singularity are mind uploading, and again, mind uploading is for a lot of transhumanists the main reason to say that technological posthumanism is actually a form, maybe a radical form of transhumanism. But at least regarding the vision of the posthuman that radically differs in transhumanism and technological posthumanism, I would say that these actually are two different discourses. And again, I have a slide with pioneers and first proponents, and again, I will skip that or save it for the discussion if you are interested in that. But people such as Ray Kurzweil, for example, Ray Kurzweil, Marvin Minsky are technological posthumanists, as I understand it. Critical posthumanism now is again very, very different from both transhumanism and technological posthumanism. Here, in critical posthumanism, the vision of the posthuman is an understanding of man that is to be located post today's essential concept of man. And to reach that transformed or new understanding of man, critical posthumanists question the traditional and mostly humanistic dichotomies such as woman, man, nature, culture, and subject-object that are fundamentally constitutive of our current understanding of the human and the cosmos in general. Critical posthumanism attempts to go beyond man by breaking with conventional categories as well as with their associated vocabulary and thinking. And again, the role and function of techniques plays a very different role in critical posthumanism as contrasted with transhumanism and technological posthumanism. Here, techniques is neither means or medium, nor is it the primary goal, aim, and end, but it is the principal category besides culture and the sciences for criticizing humanist and other traditional categories. It promises an emancipatory potential. And if you are familiar with Donna Haraway's Cyborg Manifesto, for example, that is a great example for showing the role and function of techniques as with emancipatory potential to find new ways to understand the human being. Characteristics of critical posthumanism are therefore struggling with humanism, the attempt to overcome anthropocentrism, the questioning of essentialism and philosophical anthropology, a critique of the culture of knowledge, and with culture of knowledge I mean universities and other institutions that are allowed to produce knowledge, so to speak, and a strong appeal to political action. Now it just turned black. Again, I have a slide with pioneers and first proponents. And again, I will skip that and come to my first conclusion. To summarize my thoughts up to this point, in trans and posthumanism are actually three strategies to transcend man. Transhumanism tends to enhance man to a human being X.0. Technological posthumanism primarily creates an artificial alterity. And third, critical posthumanism questions the categories that have been conventionally used to define man. And I actually made a spreadsheet and put everything in there that I said before. I don't think that I have to repeat everything that is written down in here. At least for the last line, that might be a bit interesting because there you find some current proponents. And some names you might be familiar with. For example, Nick Bostrom, he's one of the most famous transhumanists. And as I said, Ray Kurzweil is probably one of the most well-known technological posthumanists. And if it comes to critical posthumanism, some of you might know Rosie Braidotti. I mentioned Donna Haraway, although I did not put her in the spreadsheet here. Yeah, but again, I couldn't come back to that spreadsheet if you want me to in the discussion. But I will now come to the third and maybe most important part of this talk, to the humanistic enlightenment and Kantian roots in transhumanism, technological and critical posthumanism. And obviously, I will not give you an overall complex definition of what humanism is, of what the Enlightenment is, and of course, I will not give you an overall conclusion about Kantian thinking and Kant's philosophy. I will rather exclusively talk about those elements in humanism, enlightenment, and Kantian thinking that are interesting when it comes to transhumanism and technological and critical posthumanism. So I focus in the next couple of minutes on anthropology and education, on individualism and collectivism, and on mind and body. And some of these elements would not be that much of interest when you would try to find a definition of what humanism is, but those elements are important in understanding where humanism, enlightenment thinking is to be found in transhumanism and technological and critical posthumanism. And I will conclude with the idea of emancipation. And that is something that I should also say. I will more focus on the similarities between humanism, enlightenment, and Kantian thinking, rather on the differences between humanism, enlightenment, and Kantian thinking. Of course, there are differences. Of course, it's not everything the same, but you can only do so much in 30 minutes, and so I will focus on those elements that are equally to be found in humanism, enlightenment, and Kantian thinking. So I will start with anthropology and education, coming first to humanism. Since the anonymous document Rhetorica Aterenium from approximately 85 BC, and later since Aulus Gellius, who lived in the 2nd century AD, the term humanitas, which is the crux of the matter when it comes to humanism, serves as the differentia specifica between man and animal, or man and the barbarian. Humanitas means philanthropy, compassion, education, and cultivation. It requires also lifelong practice. You can lose it again if you're not careful. If you're slippery, then humanitas will get lost in your mode of existence, in your way of living. When it comes to enlightenment, reason and rationality are maybe the most important and primary sources of authority, and probably the most important human capacities per se. And maybe because of this, you could call enlightenment the scientific and educational pointed emphasis of humanism, because of course reason and rationality also play a huge role in the humanistic thinking. Although humanism also includes the body in the self-cultivation of the human being, but reason and rationality are, since ancient times, actually pretty important for the humanist agenda. When we now have a look at Kant, the first that might come to mind is the Sapere Aude, of course, the Latin phrase that means dare to know. And as you all know, Kant uses this phrase loosely translated in his essay answering the question, what is enlightenment? Habe mutig deines eigenen Verstandes zu bedienen, dare to think for yourself, and defines enlightenment as man's release from his self and courage immaturity. So again, this understanding of reason and rationality and other cognitive competences, very generally, that are also found in humanism and enlightenment are here again very prominent to be found in the Kantian thinking. Now, coming from that to transhumanism, still in transhumanist thinking we find the idealization of man as we already find it in humanism and enlightenment thinking. Transhumanists themselves often refer to Kant and also to Giovanni Pico della Mirandola's oration on the dignity of man. They they see themselves as a continuation of humanism's education program with technological means. There are explicitly a lot of transhumanists who call transhumanism as a technological humanism. They understand human enhancement as a technological form of education. That is what transhumanists themselves say. And of course, they often refer to reason and rationality as the most important criteria of good science. And very often they do that in an unreflected way. We by now, of course, know that, at least since Max Weber and in Germany, Stefan Gosepard, that you cannot just say, well, be reasonable or be rational, because there are different types of rationality and different ways to define rationality. And whenever you just refer to rationality and reason as some authority, it needs explanation. And in transhumanism, you also very often find a very unreflected usage of these terms. When it comes to technological posthumanism, you will see that technological posthumanists are mostly not explicitly, at least, interested in humanism due to its focus on the creation of an artificial superintelligence. They are not that much more interested in human beings. And that unsheaths its being a post-humanism rather than a transhumanism. And in critical posthumanism, we explicitly find the rejection of an unreflected reference to reason and rationality as the most important criteria of good science, and also a rejection of the humanist enlightenment and Kantian anthropology, due to humanism's, enlightenment's, and Kant's mostly exclusive reference to the Western, white, male, liberal human subject and the associated anthropocentrism. Actually, the anthropocentrism is maybe the crux of the matter for critical posthumanists, why they criticize humanism, enlightenment, and Kantian thinking. As you see in the footnote on the slide, for instance, in Kant's Metaphysics of Morals in Part 2, paragraph 17, he claims that one is not allowed to harm an animal, not because the animal has an intrinsic value, but because the abuse of animals ultimately leads to a barbarization of man. And that is for several critical posthumanists one reason to criticize and reject Kant's thinking at this point. However, as I just said, transhumanism is very close to humanism and the Enlightenment thinking and to Kant's philosophy. However, it can be criticized for its anti-Kantian reduction of the human being to a pure means to the end of entering the post-human era, obviously. Technological posthumanism, as I just said, radically differs from humanism, the Enlightenment, Kantian thinking. However, it sometimes, implicitly at least, shapes its vision of an artificial superintelligence and, in general, the utopia of a post-human singularity with humanist categories, and still follows the unreflected authority of reason and rationality. And critical posthumanism, as I just said, at least attempts to overcome humanistic categories. However, people such as Karen Barat and Donna Haraway still use traditional concepts such as responsibility and judgment that are very important in humanist, Enlightenment, and Kantian thinking. So, although there are very clear trends towards one or the other position, you can always flip it and see some traces of the other interpretation as well. Okay.
5 minutes.
Yep, okay. This is very confusing that this screen always turns black. Okay. When I just have 5 minutes left, then I will probably skip the last point. Okay. Then I will tell you just a little bit about individualism and collectivism. That doesn't sound very interesting when you talk about Kant or humanism, but it is both very interesting when we talk about the roots of transhumanist and posthumanist thinking. In humanism, commonly we find an individualistic anthropological view about the potential of the human subject to cultivate and educate oneself. It is more about the potential of the single, the individual human being than on the development of the whole human species. And also the Enlightenment tradition is predominantly, at least, individualistic, sometimes collectivist in terms of social critical and as a critique of religious and mythic authorities. And again, Immanuel Kant also has predominantly an individualistic perspective in terms of every human being should use her or his capacities of reason, rationality, and judgment. And all three of them, so to speak, show a general critique of any attempt to instrumentalize education. And this actually bridges the gap between the individual subject of education on the one hand and the society as a whole as the provider for educational institution structures and associated sanctions on the other hand. Now, when we have a look at transhumanism, again, we find very alike development and very alike attributes than in humanism and Enlightenment thinking. Again, transhumanism is predominantly individualistic due to its focus on the individual's morphological freedom, as Anders Sandberg would call it, or freedom of form, as Martin Rothblatt would call it, to enhance and optimize oneself. And transhumanism is commonly ignorant of the collective consequences of human enhancement. That is very problematic. You actually find very few approaches in transhumanist thinking that explicitly focus on the political and social consequences of human enhancement methods. That is a huge problem in transhumanist thinking. Technological posthumanism, again, in the final analysis, is actually a collectivist approach due to its radical vision of mind uploading and the singularity. Take, for example, Frank Tipler's omega point approach. The omega point is the point in a very far away future, in a very distant future, when the categories of time and space, as well as the categories of I, you, and we will finally collapse. So in Frank Tipler's version of the singularity, we will not only upload our mind onto a computer, but actually every border, every difference between the single individual and a collective group or something like that will finally collapse, as well as the categories of time and space. So in the end, technological posthumanism provides a radical collectivist sort of view. And critical posthumanism, again, questions in general the dualisms of individual, collective, subject, object, part, whole, etc. And I will close, if I have to, with the last slide of this point 3.2. However, there's again a however. As I just said, transhumanism primarily individualistic. However, transhumanism also is, especially when it comes to human enhancement, very close to the utilitarian thinking, and that is sort of paradox, because transhumanists very often refer explicitly to Kant and Pico della Mirandola and to a sort of deontological thinking, but when it comes to enhancement, they are very close to the utilitarian thinking, and therefore they face similar problems, because the enhancement of a person has always and necessarily collective consequences too. And when you think about utilitarian ways of talking about calculating the general good, then you have to include also very discriminative views, and yeah, that opens the floor for a lot of problems again when it comes to the human enhancement as a way of transforming the human being to a post-human being. Technological posthumanism, as I just said, appears to be the radical contrast to humanism in the Enlightenment and Kantian thinking. However, it at least implicitly cannot completely get rid, so to speak, of the individual person. And again, some visions of the post-human artificial superintelligence and the singularity show traces of individualism. And critical posthumanism, although it intends to radically question humanistic categories, and especially the concept of the liberal, autarkic, and autonomous human subject and agent, its clear political and ethical sensibility and the responsibility of the acting person shows that critical posthumanism still includes some traces of individualist acting. So, and then I will just skip the third part, mind and body, although that is, of course, very interesting, but Jesus Christ. And we'll conclude with saying that transhumanism, as I could hopefully show in the last half hour, emancipates from the human being 1.0 via cognitive and physical transformation of the human being. The technological posthumanism emancipates from the human species per se, intending to create an artificial alterity or an artificial superintelligence. And critical posthumanism intends to emancipate from the humanistic Enlightenment Kantian anthropology in view of the cosmos in general. And again, I have a spreadsheet here with everything I just said and not said before. Maybe I will just leave it with that, then you can have a look at that throughout the discussion. Yeah, thank you for your attention.
Thank you. So, Christoph.
Just a brief one. Could you expand a little bit on the term emancipation that you use? Because these three doctrines, they seem to emancipate from a line of thinking which considered itself as emancipatory. So in what sense do you mean that they are emancipating against the emancipation philosophy?
I obviously don't get the question very well. What I mean is that they...
So Kant would consider himself as an emancipatory philosopher. And how can critical transhumanism or critical posthumanism emancipate itself from classical emancipation?
Yeah, I don't use the term emancipation in that sense. What I mean when I say emancipation is that they try to develop from that they try to transform from a state of being or from a way of existing that they don't think as adequate for human beings. That is rather a very loose understanding of emancipation. I get that. Yes, of course.
Thomas Sturm.
Say that the attack upon Kantian individualism is Excuse me. A question about Kant. Could one say that the attack upon what they call Kantian individualism is the attack on a caricature, a strawman argument? Because if you look into Kant's anthropology as it really is, not some sort of made-up version, on the very first few pages, you find a strong attack by Kant on what he calls egoism. Yeah, and he says that it is a core lesson of his anthropology that he's going to develop over the next 200 pages or so. And I mean the real book, the anthropology from a point of view, pragmatic point of view. That he's going to develop an attack on various kinds of egoism. Logical egoism, that is egoism in the epistemological sphere where you think you know everything. Practical egoism, where you don't care about others. And the third one is aesthetic egoism, and puts as the contrasting alternative to that the point of view that he calls cosmopolitanism. Yeah. And for instance, in the epistemological and practical spheres, that includes that whatever answer you give to an epistemic or practical question or problem, you ought to consider whether that is an answer that could be accepted by everyone. Yeah, that is extremely clear. Yeah, and another point that is also developed in the anthropology is that, and that relates to the education point. Yeah, while you might say that the goal of education is to improve individual persons, it's also, of course, to improve the development of mankind as a whole. And he says that there is a particular paradox, namely the human being is the only being that needs education, the only animal that needs education, and he, or as we would say, she, who does so, is another human being. That's Rousseau's paradox.
Right.
So either in terms of the process of education, nor in terms of the product of that process, the aim towards which we aim, Kant is particularly individualistic. Yeah? And I wonder where this extreme, let me be emphatic about this, this extreme stereotype has emerged from, that we have, that makes possible this kind of discourse. And whether you would not agree, or attack me if you want to, that this is indeed a strawman argument, and maybe we should do the same thing with lots of other Enlightenment authors that are being attacked here explicitly or implicitly in this discourse. I understand that you gave us a representation of a discourse which you do not necessarily commit yourself to.
Well,
but I think when you do that, you ought also to consider how far that discourse includes stereotypes.
of course, all of these three discourses include stereotypes, all of them. And when it comes to criticizing individualism, whether it is Kantian individualism or Enlightenment individualism or individualism you find in humanist thinking, for example, for critical posthumanists, it is more a critique of the autarkic liberal human subject. That is the most important agent in these discourses. And of course, this is also a stereotype. And what critical posthumanists such as Donna Haraway and others do is not to say we have to get rid of that. We have to completely forget about the individual human subject. Of course not. It is rather the attempt to, first of all, find new ways to define subjects and agents. For example, to also consider non-human subjects and as agents that are equally to human beings part of the moral universe, and also to find ways to understand traditional individualistic competences such as autonomy and responsibility more in a relational way, in a procedural way. And there are very different answers provided by Karen Barat and Carrie Wolf and others that I cannot adequately summarize in a couple of minutes. But all of these attempts are not attempts to get rid of the human subject or the liberal subject or something like that, but more to complement this traditional understanding of the Western liberal human subject with another point of view, because that would maybe something that Donna Haraway and others would say, given history, we see that the Western liberal human subjects has brought us in a lot of conflicts in terms of discrimination and exclusion of other beings. And therefore, they try to find alternatives that, again, should not replace the understanding of the liberal subject, but complement it. So, and whether or not this is a good and very detailed understanding of Kant, that is another question, obviously. But it is something that can be drawn from several humanist and Enlightenment texts, I would guess. So.
Short follow-up.
I'm sorry, but I think we are timed out. There are several other people in the queue, but I don't think we have time for any more questions. There is the coffee break, if we have time for that, where you could pursue some of these matters further. So, Janina, thank you very much. Sorry to cut things short.
Thank you.
And next speaker is Martin Sticker. Yeah, sorry, we were kind of...
No, it's fine. It's fine.
We got the full 40 minutes, but we're... we're already running
Yeah,
late, so I don't want to run more
of
late.
course.
How do I run a PowerPoint here?
Ask Janina have the PowerPoint.
What do I do with the PowerPoint? I have a stick.
You have to put it over there. In the,
Okay.
Yeah.
Do you want to take another question?
Yeah, of course.
So, but Jürgen Stolzenberg, we have time for one more quick question because whilst Martin is setting up, Jürgen, would you like to ask it? Yes, for Janina.
Thank you very much. Perhaps I summarize my question. These different species tell us different stories. And I think there's a principle, like you mentioned it, like evolution. But in what sense can we say that this will be an evolution? Do the proponents of the different species mean or believe that this will be our natural development?
Yes, transhumanists would.
Okay,
Yeah.
or is this a artificial changement?
No, it's a natural way of development.
Yes, this would happen
Yes.
with us.
Yes. Well, they are
Yeah.
in a way they are paradox here. On the one hand, people like Bostrom always say that you find this sort of thinking also in the Epic of Gilgamesh, for example. You find that in almost every important document in human history that the human beings are that it is in the conditio humana that human beings will eventually transcend themselves. And so actually we could lean back and cross our arms and nature would in the end reach the post-human era on its very own. But on the other hand, transhumanists are very direct when it comes to getting a bit quicker there to reach the post-human era a bit quicker. So we could take nature in our very own hands and could speed up this process.
Yes.